The Takings Clause, part of which amendment? That's right, the Fifth Amendment. Reading, the government may not take private property for public use without, that's right, just compensation. Let's add two more elements to that. The government may not take private property for public use defined under Kelo as public purpose without just compensation based on what? That's right, fair market value at the time of the taking. So our general rule is that the government may not take private property for public use, meaning public purpose, without just compensation based on fair market value at the time of the taking. All right, try to state the general rule. The government may not take private property for public use defined as public purpose under Kelo without just compensation based on, that's right, fair market value at the time of the taking. What is our standard of scrutiny? It is rational basis review with the burden on the government. Rational basis review, burden on the government to show that the taking is rationally related to any legitimate public purpose. Rational basis review with the burden on the government. Okay, so we have three types of takings. One, a physical taking. Two, a total regulatory taking. And a partial regulatory taking, also called the Penn Central taking. Physical taking, easy. Any permanent physical invasion, no matter how minor. A physical taking is any permanent, what type of invasion? Physical, no matter how minor. Any permanent physical invasion, no matter how minor. What are we talking about? Running cable lines, expanding a highway. A physical taking is, state the general rule. That's right, any permanent physical invasion, no matter how minor. What if it's a temporary taking? If the taking is temporary, we will balance the purpose of the taking and the length of the taking to determine if justice requires just compensation. A physical taking is any permanent physical invasion, no matter how minor. But if it is temporary, we're going to balance the purpose and the length of the taking to see if justice will require just compensation. So there can be a permanent physical taking, and that's always going to require, that's right, just compensation based on fair market value at the time of the taking. But if we have a temporary taking, we're going to balance the purpose of the taking, the length of the taking, that's important, right? To determine if just compensation is required. So it's either required or it's not required. If it's permanent, it's always required. If the taking is temporary, then we need to look at the facts to see whether the purpose and the length of the taking justifies just compensation. That's our number one, physical taking. Number two is our total regulatory taking, which deprives the property owner of, you know it, all beneficial use of the property. A total regulatory taking deprives the property owner of all, what kind of use? Beneficial use of the property. That is a total regulatory taking. That one's easy, right? Deprives the owner of all beneficial use of the property. Done, end of story. Regulatory taking. Partial regulatory taking, also known as a Penn Central taking, based on the famous Penn Central versus New York case. All right, we have a three-part rule. for a partial regulatory taking. 1, the impact of the regulation on the claimant. 2, the extent to which the regulation interferes with investment-backed expectations. And 3, the character of the governmental action. Number 1, the impact of the regulation on the claimant. Number 2, the extent to which the regulation does what? That's right, interferes with distinct investment-backed expectations. And 3, the character of the governmental action. For a partial regulatory taking, we're not going to get just compensation. There's no taking if an economically viable interest remains. Remember, in Penn Central, they were denied the ability to build a huge addition on top of Penn Central Station, yet the city offered them office space in other areas to compensate. So Penn Central test is what? 1, impact of the regulation on the claimant. 2, the extent to which the regulation interferes with distinct investment-backed expectations. And 3, the character of the governmental action. There is not a taking if what? Some economically viable interest remains. All right, let's take the general rule for a taking. Try it on your own. That's right, the government may not take private property for public use, meaning public purpose, without just compensation based on fair market value at the time of the taking. And the burden is on who? The government, to show that it is rationally related to a legitimate government interest. Rational basis review with the burden on the government. What's our physical taking? Any permanent physical invasion, no matter how minor. If it is a temporary physical taking, what do we look to? That's right, the purpose of the taking and the length of the taking to determine if the owner gets just compensation. Second, we have our total regulatory taking, the easiest type. It deprives, that's right, the property owner of all beneficial use of the property. And then we have our partial regulatory or Penn Central taking, in which we balance 1, 2, 3. 1, impact of the regulation on the claimant. 2, the extent to which the regulation interferes with distinct investment-backed expectations. And 3, that's right, the character of the governmental action. And if some economically viable interest remains, do we have a regulatory taking? No. And that is the takings clause.